The most significant question facing all of mankind is that of the existence of God. Thus, the Bible chairs, located on the campuses of North Texas State University and Texas Woman's University under the oversight of the University Church of Christ, promoted the Warren-Flew debate. Because of the importance of this question, it was necessary to invite the two most capable men available who had attained the doctorate degree in the field of philosophy to debate this issue. Dr. Thomas B. Warren of the Harding Graduate School of Religion in Memphis, Tennessee, was selected to defend the existence of God. Dr. A.G.N. Flew of the University of Reading in Reading, England, was selected to defend the atheistic position. Dr. Flew is recognized as one of the leading philosophers of the world holding to the atheistic position. We welcome you now to the concluding session of the Warren-Flew debate. Does God exist? Dr. Warren affirms, I know that God does exist.
Dr. Flew, gentlemen moderators, ladies and gentlemen, I assure you that it is indeed a matter of great pleasure to me to be before you tonight in affirmation of the proposition which has been read in your hearing. And before I continue with the presentation of affirmative arguments, I should like to pay just a little attention to some of the things said by Dr. Flew in his closing negative last evening. Since he had nearly a 20-minute speech in that negative and I had only a minute and a half rejoinder, it was of course impossible for me to deal with everything that he said. And one thing I want to make clear is he seemed to recognize that he had not done or performed as he should have when he was in the affirmative, and that he had not done as he should when he was in the negative, and then sought to get me into the same bed, as it were, with him, saying that I had not been functioning in the affirmative, that I had gotten over into the negative. But I want to point out that it is the responsibility of the affirmative speaker not only to give precise argumentation as I did, those of you who were here last night know that I did so, but it is also the responsibility of the affirmative speaker to reply to what the negative speaker says. And so in replying to what he was saying, I was not forsaking my role as an affirmative speaker. Now, Dr. Flew has suggested last evening that the market value of a Volkswagen might shed some light on the matter of moral value. He said that the market value of a Volkswagen isn't necessarily the price that I want to pay, then it is not the value that I simply invent. On the other hand, if there were no humans around, the car would have no market value at all. But I have some questions for Dr. Flew along that line. If the Volkswagen is worth $500 at one place and its market value is $1,000 at another place, how is the actual or real value of the car to be decided, or does it have any real value? Now, if your illustration is worth anything at all, it will have to have some real value, or else you'll have to say that no human being has any real value, and you will have joined the Nazis in a thoroughgoing way to say that the Jewish people didn't have any real value, only a market value that might fluctuate up and down and therefore would be worth nothing under the regime of the Nazis. Dr. Flew, you ought to think those illustrations through before you give them. Now, on the matter of matter, Dr. Flew claims that the difference between him and me is that we only stop at different places in lacking explanation. One time he seemed to indicate that he didn't really hold to the eternality of matter, but Dr. Flew, you can't do that. Not in being an atheist. You've got to come on with it and admit that you've got to hold to eternality of matter. But let's see something about that. A thing that he writes about and has really hinted at in this discussion is what he terms the Stratonicean presumption. Now, this is merely an assumption. It begs the question, as I've already explained in quite some detail. It's really ridiculous and incoherent, for it says that everything there is a product of nature, and since nature makes nature a product of itself, and therefore is entirely meaningless. It is not even an explanation, as a matter of fact, because of its incoherency. It doesn't explain matter. It doesn't explain its origin. It doesn't explain its existence today. It's simply that he begs the question by starting with it. Dr. Flew, get on with your job of proving the eternality of matter, for it's absolutely necessary to your case. But we, that is, as theists, have an explanation. We are not in the same hole with you on that matter, Dr. Flew, at all. God Almighty is an explanation for the world. It's an explanation for humankind, which you have admitted tacitly that you have no explanation for. God is the explanation which needs no explanation. He is in fact the self-existent being who accounts for the world and for mankind. I should like to note this in connection with his instructions or his points on matter and refer to the second law of thermodynamics from physics. And I have it formulated in a syllogistic form. Now it seems that Dr. Flew in this debate has given a very little credence to precise logical argumentation. This is in sharp contrast to what he does when he writes and opposes other men. He chides other men when they do not write logically. He jumps on them, as it were, with both feet. He demands that they be rational. And to be rational means that you draw only such conclusions as are warranted by the evidence. And as I've quoted from Dr. Max Black of Cornell University, a world-renowned logician, who said, and quoting Josiah Stamp in his book, Critical Thinking, 400 pages of crowded fact and argument may deceive the very elect, but when reduced to a three-line syllogism, it will lay bare the bones of the argument so that fallacious reasoning may be understood. That's why theists are not afraid to lay their doctrine on the line and say, here it is, in precise logical argumentation, while atheists will say, oh, but here's a suggestion and there's a suggestion, and we don't really need this kind of logical argumentation. But I'm going to give it to you whether Dr. Flew thinks we need it or not, because I think you can see in the light of his own contention, which I've read from his works, that to be irrational is to refuse to face up to the implications of your doctrine, to refuse to face up to the implication of your basic premises and draw that conclusion. Now notice carefully this reasoning. If the second law of thermodynamics is meaningful only in a finite system, and if it is meaningful in the world, then the world is a finite system. Second premise, the second law of thermodynamics is meaningful only in a finite system, and if it is meaningful in the world, therefore the world is a finite system and is not eternal. Now, to know that that is not so, in order to meet the point that I have made here, Dr. Flew will have to know, not merely to guess, not merely to say it seems strange to me or has some sort of a curious aspect, but he's got to know that the second law of thermodynamics is false. Now, Dr. Flew, I suggest that you give your attention to that in the matter of what you have argued in the matter of matter. Dr. Flew's position demands that matter is eternal. If not, then at one time nothing existed, because you see he maintains that nothing but matter exists. Now, if nothing but matter exists and at one time matter didn't exist, then that would mean that nothing existed. But if ever were the case that nothing existed, then nothing would exist now. But it is therefore the case clear that something does exist now, so it's just as clear that Dr. Flew is wrong. As it seems he usually is, and I say this kindly, I even say it lovingly, as he usually is on almost everything he's said in this discussion. Now, he talked about Pascal's wager. My moderator passed me a note last night, and Dr. Flew struck out on Pascal and said, "Congratulations, Tom, for such a wonderful argument which you made on Pascal," indicating that in making an argument on Pascal, he was following me as the affirmative speaker, when of course I'd said nothing about it. But there's nothing new about this. We study about this in our classes every year. Many of my students are here, and I'm sure that they knew exactly what was coming, and that was very little. Well, why Flew introduced Pascal's wager? Not because I introduced the matter as an affirmative speaker. I think Flew simply brought along an article from the Rationalist Annual and read it, or at least he read something that's very close to what is in that book or that journal. But he seemed to be using it in something of an effort to counter my argument, which had been set out on 41Z, I believe it is, in which I showed that every human being owes his ultimate origin either to creation or to evolution. I then showed that this was strong disjunction because it constitutes the only alternatives. I then showed if it is by creation, then God exists. I then showed that if evolution is true, then it was either by being born of some ape or some other non-human being or being transformed from an ape. But Dr. Flew has clearly admitted the error of both of those, that no one has ever been born of an ape or has been transformed from an ape. Therefore, by conjunction, I pointed out that it is both false that one is born of an ape and that one is transformed from an ape. Therefore, we have by De Morgan's theorem, after that conjunction, it is false that either by birth or by transformation, which means that you have then the falsity of the consequent of that first or of that third premise, E implies either B or T. Now, when you have a form of that kind, it means that you have also falsified the antecedent of that argument, which means that if you have the case that if evolution is true, then it is either by birth or by transformation, but if it's false, that it's either by birth or transformation, then evolution is false. He therefore has granted, I have hammered this matter, pleaded, begged, cajoled, and done everything I know to do to get him to notice this matter, and he has paid absolutely no attention to it. That by these concessions, he has clearly admitted that human beings are not here by evolution, and the only alternative is creation, and since creation can occur only by God, then God exists. But now notice, he is trying here to use Pascal's wager as he gets into the matter of there being many options. But there are not many options. There is either God or there is not God. This is not a matter of simply looking out here and saying, well, there is the God envisioned by Hartshorne, or the God envisioned by Brightman, or the God envisioned by Whitehead, or the God envisioned by the Hindus, and so forth and so on. As was made clear by one speaker who said, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of the Amorites, of the gods on the other side of the river, the gods of the Amorites in whose land you now dwell, but as for me and my house, we will serve Jehovah. It is either God or no God. There are many things that are called God, but there is simply the eternal God. Now, in the matter of eternal punishment, Dr. Flew's treatment of the matter, to prove some kind of inner incompatibility in the concept of God, this is what he's after. I pointed out that he cannot do it by simply taking the concept of God, but he's got to try to use some empirical fact or some action. And therefore, he's saying that if indeed there is eternal punishment, there is incompatibility and God does not exist. He has not really formulated a precise argument. I'm going a little farther than he did in making his argument somewhat for him. I wish he would make it precisely so that we could see perhaps even better what he means. But now note this reply. His effort fails. I admit that the question of evil might be considered to be relevant to the question of the existence of God, but remember, the existence of real or objective moral evil proves God. It does not disprove God, it proves God, because it demands the objective moral standard which actually is God. God is the ultimate good. Again and again and again, every night in the questions and in his speeches, Dr. Flew has hammered back and forth between subjective view of morality and objective view of morality, and he's done so again in the answers to the questions tonight, which I shall get to in the second speech. But the eternal punishment of the wicked is not evil. The only intrinsic evil is sin, violation of the will of God. These are not evil. Flew has made no effort whatever to prove that eternal punishment is evil. He slides over this responsibility of his in the light of his particular argument. In fact, there's no way he can prove it. He admitted that if God did exist and were even finitely just, that it would be just for God to punish a wicked man for at least 1 minute after this life is over. Now notice carefully, last night in a question he admitted that it would be just for the God who is infinite in justice to punish a man for 1 minute. In making this admission, Dr. Flew elicited a response from which he apparently misunderstood and clearly misrepresented to this audience my position. In attempting to explain my response to the audience, he charged me with holding that there is no difference between punishment of 1 minute duration and 1 billion years. Dr. Flew, I'm sure you did not do it on purpose, but that is as far from my position as anything possibly could be imagined. The truth is, my argument was not even related to such a contention. My point was this, and let us look at chart number 27A16, and following that, chart 27A17. Now again, I want to give this argument, and I want you to notice carefully. It is formulated precisely. The argument is valid, and the premises are true, and the conclusion, therefore, must follow. It must be sound. It is an amazing thing to me that we're involved here in a philosophic discussion with men who are now contending that they're under no responsibility to present precise logical argument. This will surely be a shock to the philosophical world when it becomes well known among our colleagues in the philosophical associations. Number one, here's the first statement in this argument. If Flew grants that God, who is infinite in justice, can justly punish a wicked man for some length of time, say X, after this life is over, Then Flew grants that God, who is infinite in justice, can justly punish a wicked man for that length of time plus 1 minute. That is, length of time x plus 1 minute. Now I want you to catch the significance of that. The second statement is, Flew grants, under question number 5 last evening, that God, who in the question was described as being infinite in justice, can justly punish a wicked man for some given length of time, specifically 1 minute after this life is over. Therefore, here's the conclusion, therefore, Flew grants that God, who is infinite in justice, can justly punish a wicked man for that length of time plus 1 minute. That is, the length of time x plus 1 minute. Now notice, friends, what has occurred. This is just another way of describing infinity or eternity. It is in fact another way of saying that the God of infinite justice can, with justice, punish a wicked man eternally. Now, Dr. Flew, if anybody ever gave up on a point that he himself had introduced into a discussion, I suggest kindly, I suggest gently, yet I suggest firmly that you have done it. This constitutes an admission on Flew's part that God, who is infinite in justice, can eternally punish a wicked man and still be just in doing so. Now, I ask you to be on guard against his coming up here and saying, well, this is a curious matter. We ought to have gone about it this way, or we ought to have gone about it this way. But any man who wants to function as a rational thinker, a man who wants to function as a rational philosopher, rather than as an existentialist, will take up this argument and will deal with it point by point. He will show either one of two things, either that the argument is invalid or that one of the premises is false. Otherwise, that conclusion follows and it is sustained, and this man, this atheist, has admitted that it is just for an infinite God to punish a man eternally. And it's the only argument that he's had in the whole debate. It's the only argument that any atheist has against theism, namely that there is some sort of contradiction between the eternal God and some sort of problem or suffering or wrong. In Revelation chapter 20 and verse 10, the Bible says, and where also the beast and the false prophet are, that would indicate at some moment of time where they are, and then it says, and they shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. Now, friends, putting it back in our term, that the philosophical jargon that we philosophers use as we throw dust in the air and then wonder why nobody can see anything, it's x, and then x plus 1, and then x plus 2, and so on till x plus n. That's on to infinity. Now I want to introduce again the argument which I referred to a moment ago, that if there is even one characteristic, now I want you to note how this argument is formulated. If there is even one characteristic, attribute, or property of even one human being, now I'm one human being, I have special insight into me, and you have special insight into you, which could have come into existence only by the creative power of God, then that one human being constitutes proof that God does exist. Here's the second premise. There is at least one characteristic, attribute, or property of at least one human being which could have come into existence only by the creative power of God. Here's the conclusion. Therefore, that one human being constitutes proof, when the evidence is recognized and reasoned about property, that God does exist. Now, friends, that argument's valid. The premises are true. Therefore, the conclusion must be true. Now, let's look at this 41Z again. Dr. Flew, I ask you, in all kindness, to recognize your responsibility. You've already admitted the validity of this argument. I ask you now, since you have admitted that validity, to point out which of the premises on this argument is false. Now, if you cannot do that, you will have admitted that the case is sustained. I have said that there's strong disjunction between creation and evolution. There are no other possibilities. Human beings, I'm talking about human beings alive here on this earth. I'm talking about myself as an individual. I am here owing my ultimate origin either to the creative, miraculous act of God or else to evolution from some ape or some other form of non-human life. Now I've shown that if it's by creation, then God exists. If it is by evolution, then it's by birth or transformation. Dr. Flew has admitted in the fourth case that it's not by birth. He's admitted in the fifth case it's not by transformation from an ape. Nobody's ever born of an ape. Nobody's ever changed from an ape into a human. Therefore, it is in the conjunction of those two, you have not B and not T, and then by De Morgan's theorem, you have it is false, that disjunction either B or T, either by birth or transformation. Therefore, evolution is false, because when you go back up to point 3, you have the falsification of the consequent, which means then that the antecedent, that is the E, what comes before the if-then, must also be falsified, and therefore not evolution but creation.
You may notice that as a sort of tribute to the influence of the Texan ethos, I thought I might wear my brightest shirt and tie this evening. But to turn to the subject, well, first thing about market value, I hope I didn't confuse people about this. Of course, I don't think that moral value is in all respects like market value. One, of course, terribly important dissimilarity is precisely that market value does vary very freely with place and time. The reason I introduced that illustration was to try to bring out that saying that values are in some sense, and I try to explain in what sense I meant, a function of human desires and so on, i.e. that there couldn't be any sort of value in a world that was totally uninhabited. What I was trying to show was that to say this is not the same thing as saying, nor does it warrant one going immediately to say that all talk about morality is a matter of the expression of the preferences of the individual speaking, or of this group or of that. I wanted to show how it's possible for something to be a matter of some sort of value, and for the particular value in question to be independent of the desires of any particular person or group. Second thing, about the eternity of matter. Well, certainly I am inclined to believe that the universe was without beginning and will be without end. Indeed, I know no good reasons for disputing either of these suggestions. But I don't think either of them, and in particular the one that Dr. Warren is the more concerned with, the one about the beginning, is something that an atheist naturalist is by his atheist naturalism committed to defending. He probably will defend it for other reasons. And the reason he isn't committed to defending this is there's nothing actually contradictory in the suggestion that indeed the universe might have had a beginning, and there might have been absolutely nothing before that. I don't believe that this was so, but I don't see anything contradictory in this suggestion. Then back again to the eternal punishment. And perhaps this would be a good occasion to say that I've seen a lot of members of the Church of Christ in the last few days, and the disparity between their goodness and forthcomingness about as people concerned with other people, and the nature of the God that they admire as supremely just is perfectly extraordinary. I'm very glad indeed that they, in fact, live as they do and do not model themselves upon the being whom they describe as perfectly just and so on. And it might be a good way of answering Dr. Warren's second question of this evening, which he hasn't yet come to, which I notice I omitted to answer. The question was, by what standard do you judge that it is evil that anyone should be punished in eternal hell? I think the best answer for that is by the sort of everyday standards of human decency and compassion and concern that I am sure that all the members of the Church of Christ here live by. The sort of good neighborliness and concern for people that they show in their ordinary life. It's by those standards that I judge the conduct ascribed by Dr. Warren, and I fear by many of those Church of Christ members, to their God. I describe it as the rather rude things I do describe it as by just those standards. Fourth thing about evolution and creation. Oh dear me. I don't think that the disproof of Darwin's particular theory of evolution by natural selection, or of any alternative theory of evolution, is going to take, I mean, it's not going to happen, but it would not, if it were disproved, begin to establish the sorts of things that it seems to me that Dr. Warren thinks would be established by this. After all, the theory of evolution is a theory about what goes on and what has gone on within the universe. It would be perfectly consistent to suggest that, there have been jumps in the development of things within the universe, that these are either just inexplicable, they just happened, or perhaps more engagingly, that they were the work of several powerful spirits within the universe, or one. None of this begins to get us to the creator of the whole thing with the desired and approved characteristics. Now, it's not that I believe that the theory of evolution is in any serious danger of being shown to be untrue, but I think it is just worth pointing out that even if it were, what is at stake is not quite what Dr. Warren thinks is at stake. It might well be that a proof of the theory of evolution would disprove Dr. Warren's religion, but I don't think a disproof of the theory of evolution would establish the whole works. And I suppose this would be a good moment to say something about the respiratory system. I don't know a terrible lot about the respiratory system. I'm not at all sure that anyone has got more than the roughest of rough outlines of the evolution of the respiratory system. But then, one can have very good reasons for believing in the general theory of evolution without having at this stage a full account of the whole course of the whole process. A full account of the whole course of the whole process is just not going to be had for a very long time indeed. What is surely sufficient to make the theory of evolution by natural selection immensely plausible is that it can be made to fit a large area, that where it is tested it is not disconfirmed, and that continual progress is made in filling in some of the gaps. Well, now what are we going to? I think we better get back to objective value and higher laws. Once again, rather wearisomely. So, once again, let me start by saying that I am, in this matter, genuinely agnostic about a lot of issues. That's to say, I do not believe that the work of the moral philosophers has been completed. All I can offer here is some things that seem to me to be clearly true, and I can offer the reasons for saying them. I can't here give a complete story, and later we will no doubt find from my answers to Dr. Warren's question 9 of this evening that I do not claim to be able to give a complete moral philosophy. Well, now, some of the things that seem to me to be relevant and also to be true. First, value, including moral value, is some sort of function of human preferences and human wants and human needs. Now, what and just about all that I think one can mean by this claim, what and just about all that it implies, is that in an uninhabited universe, nothing could be said to be valuable or valueless. To use the same illustration for the third time, it would be as absurd to speak of moral value with respect to such a universe as it would be to ask for the market value or market price of anything in it. Second, to say that something ought or ought not to be done, that something is or is not good or evil, is nevertheless not the same as, nor does it by itself imply, that any particular individual likes or dislikes that something, or stands to gain or lose by it. Some new stuff here. When in Plato's Republic the cynic Thrasymachus said, "By the word justice we mean nothing else but the advantage of the stronger," what he was saying did not just happen to be wrong. Thrasymachus, in saying this, was fundamentally, totally, diametrically wrong, and hence rather usefully wrong. When we say, in our cynical and debunking moments, that when those characters, those corrupt and hypocritical characters, say that they are concerned to establish a just society, a socially just society, what they really mean is they hope to get or to retain well-paying government jobs in welfare agencies. If we ever say this sort of thing, you know, when they talk about justice or social justice, what they really mean is, of course, it's quite wrong to construe this statement as an account of what the word justice means on their lips. What the word justice means on their lips is presumably much the same as whatever the word justice means on our lips. This is one of those cases where hypocrisy is the tribute which vice pays to virtue. What we're after is saying that, of course, justice doesn't mean anything of the such. What they would say if they weren't being such an odious lot of hypocrites is that there's a fat job in Washington in it for me, and I am pretending to fool you to be concerned about justice and social justice. Now, more positively, the whole point of an appeal to justice is that it should be an appeal from any and all particular or group interests to a standard by which adjudications can be made between such possibly, and indeed usually, conflicting individual or group interests. Thrasymachus was thus totally, fundamentally, diametrically, yet instructively wrong in trying to define the word justice in terms of a particular set of interests. Third thing, morality, and if you like, the moral law, is of its very nature a higher law than any system of positive law. And by positive law is meant the law of any particular country or custom with the force of law or international law, a system laid down by men with punishments attached and so on. Now, all such systems of positive law are in principle reviewable and judgeable by reference to, if you like, a higher law, or if you don't like, by reference to morality. Well, what does this mean? It means that it always makes sense to ask, yes, it is United States law, Texas law, British law, even international law, but is it right? Is it just? Ought it to be as it is? ought US, Texas, British or international law to be as it is. That's what I mean by saying it's a higher law, that it's in principle possible to raise these questions about any other system. Now, where are we? First, the first point was to show what's meant by saying that value is some sort of function of human desires, needs, and so on. Second point was to bring out that and in what sense moral and other sorts of value can nevertheless be objective, i.e. independent of people's passing wants, group interests, and so on. The third point was to show that and in what sense moral assessment is essentially an appeal to a higher law. These three, shall we flatteringly call them insights, all prepare the way for the most relevant fourth point. Nothing said under the first three heads says or implies anything about God. While this is so, indicates that the objectivity and the overridingness of morality is in no way dependent upon, nor does it owe its authority to, the will of any super being. The most, and it could in practice be a most important most, the most which any such super being could do here is something utterly different. It could throw its power behind whatever is moral, or for that matter, it could throw it behind whatever is immoral, and it could reward or punish those who acted or failed to act on whatever principles it decided to support. The fourth insight, to which all the first three have been building up, is derived, once again, from that famous old challenge in Plato's dialogue Euthyphro. Are the things which are just because God endorses them, or does God endorse the things which are just because they are just? And maybe, in order not to be distracted by any claims that, since the word God is in part defined in terms of justice and goodness, anything correctly described as God must be good and just, let's reformulate that question as referring only to an omnipotent being. Are the things which are just because some omnipotent being endorses them, or does some omnipotent being endorse them, if he does, because they are just? Now, anyone who chooses the first of these two alternatives thereby abandons morality in favor of the worship of naked power. For by making this choice, he in effect defines the word justice in terms of the sheer will of any being that happens to be omnipotent. The word justice, so defined, no longer refers to any standard which is objective in the sense explained, or overriding in the sense explained. And the respondent in question, the person who answers like this, by defining the word justice in this way, makes it very clear that he is in favor of anything whatsoever which his particular Mr. Big shall choose to support. But anyone who chooses the second alternative becomes, by that choice, committed to recognizing both that standards of justice are indeed, in the sense given, objective, and not definable in terms of the will of any individual or group, not even in terms of the will of an all-powerful being. And he also becomes committed to saying that the conduct attributed to an all-powerful being can be assessed by reference to those objective standards. And under that assessment, that being may not even achieve a passing grade. Now, those are the things which, for the reasons given, I reckon are both relevant and can reasonably be said to be known about morality in this context. There are a great many other things about the general principles, the theory of morality, to which I do not know the answer. Trying to find the answers is what moral philosophy is about. Yes. Thanks. Yes. So what can I usefully do in that other minute. Oh, yes, there is one small point we might as well get straight. This is the first of the questions in my multiple choice test. If it's the case that real objective moral value is comparable to market value, then it's the case that it's possible that real objective moral value can change, i.e. it's the case that the torturing and murdering of the Jews by the Nazis could properly come to be considered to be morally right. Well, I did that one false. I ought, before doing it false, to have crossed out that to be considered to be. Because, after all, it's not in dispute between Dr. Warren and myself that people might very well mistakenly change their views about what was moral or not. Clearly, the crux and the point that he wanted to ask me was whether it would actually, in fact, cease to be immoral and become moral. He was not wanting to ask me whether people might change their minds. Of course they might change their minds. People might become mistaken about this, or they might get right about it. I think we'll sacrifice, not very sadly, about 20 seconds.